Now, it's not the first time that the voluntary sector has faced the possibility of significant cuts in funding. As you remember, or many of you will remember, in the 90s, the Liberal government went through its own process of getting its deficit under control. And the form it took was downloading of responsibilities to lower levels of government, often without the requisite funding to meet those responsibilities. And at the end of the line, as always, are the charities and community organizations that provide services to vulnerable groups in the community. They were the ones who, in the end, bore much of the brunt of cost cutting. And they responded, as such organizations always do, by tightening their belts until they could hardly breathe, and many of them actually stopped breathing. The mantra that we hear whenever this happens is, we have to do more with less. And curiously, it's usually said by those who have more to those who have less. The organizations that I think were particularly negatively impacted were national associations, many of which simply closed their doors, and groups involved in advocacy. It's interesting that some years later, in a conversation with former Prime Minister Paul Martin, who at that time, of course, was the finance minister presiding over these cuts, I was talking about the impact on the sector, and he said, you know, we didn't know how seriously impacted the sector was. That wasn't at all the government's intention. It was a kind of collateral damage because we simply weren't on the government's radar. And he said, when they began to realize how fundamentally they were weakening the sector and what the implications might be for Canadian families and individuals, you know, they tried to take some remedial action by offering more incentives for donations. But I think the important lesson from that is that we think, because we're doing good work and because we're committed and motivated, that this is recognized by people in government and indeed by our fellow citizens. But outside the sector, it often is not recognized. As I say, it goes under the radar. And when you have fewer resources, as so many organizations experienced in the 90s, of course, it's hard to hire staff. It's hard to retain the staff you have. It's hard to attract young people because you're not able to offer any security of employment. It's hard to ramp up services to meet greater demands in the community. And that, of course, leaves the people we're concerned about at greater risk. Now, in the 90s, we understood that this was a kind of cyclical process. This was one of those blips that if we could just somehow make it through, things would improve. And I think there's a tendency to think that's the situation now, but it's not. I believe that we're in a very different situation now. For one thing, in the 90s, our population was still growing, which means that we could count on economic growth simply as a result of having more people to produce and to consume, and therefore to contribute to gross domestic product. But that's not the case now. We weren't dealing in the 90s with the kind of global economic turmoil that we see in the world today. We were lucky in a sense. We faced this difficult period of getting the deficit under control a decade before other countries, or 2 decades. We're seeing now how much more dramatic it is in Europe and in the United States in the context of a global economic downturn. So as I say, this time I think is different. And I say that even recognizing that Saskatchewan isn't facing the same stresses as other parts of Canada. But this is a province that has known the booms and busts of a commodity-based economy. And despite, certainly from outside the province, looking at this with a measure of envy, perhaps helped by the fact that we're not trying to buy houses in Saskatoon, you can ignore the fact that still in this relatively well-off province at the moment, enjoying the fruits of a boom in commodity prices, 37% of female-led single-parent households live under the poverty line in Saskatchewan. That's a shocking statistic. 20% of all Saskatchewan children live in poverty, which is higher than the average for Canada as a whole. So there's still a need, despite the relative prosperity that many of us are experiencing, to deal with the challenges that the YW has always had to deal with: poverty, homelessness, the needs of women who are in abusive relationships or who are facing a situation of homelessness. So the circumstances are perhaps now a little bit more challenging than they were in the 90s. We're also facing, of course, this very significant shift in the structure of the global economy, which predates the financial crisis, the end of an era in which the global economy was driven by the countries around the North Atlantic. And this is going to have profound implications for Canada. And we have to bear in mind that Canada has had a long history of poor competitiveness internationally, an over-reliance probably on untreated exports of natural products, a lack of entrepreneurialism, a lack of competitiveness when it comes to innovation. So the message I really want to give to you today is simply that we can't afford to have the voluntary sector, the community sector, the organizations represented by the YW of Saskatoon, among others, take it for granted. The good news is that there are many interesting and innovative things happening as well. One is that faced with this rather murky financial picture, more and more organizations are looking to identify whether there's some form of social enterprise that they can engage in to make them less dependent on unreliable grants from governments or uncertain levels of donations from the public. And in this, the YW has been one of the leaders. It's fascinating that even back in the beginning of the YW in Saskatoon, the women who were being offered places in the homes, in the home created, paid for it, $20 a month, which was not a negligible amount. But this is something which is happening now more broadly in the sector. People are saying we've got to be able to identify ways in which we can generate our own revenues in order to support our programs. I think we could describe this as moving from a funding model for organizations to a financing model. In other words, instead of thinking there's a problem here, we need to find a solution for it and then go and look for a grant, people are saying there's a problem, we think we have a solution, we have to have a business model which will sustain that work rather than rely on grants. The not so good news is that other countries are going much faster and further than Canada is in trying to free up this kind of entrepreneurial spirit among the not-for-profit sector. In the UK and the US, for example, the government has actually created a corporate structure which recognizes that there's no need to make this binary distinction between being entirely for-profit or entirely not-for-profit. There's a whole range of activities that actually combine some financial return with some social return. Co-ops are an example of this. But Canada is not, so far, following in this path. The UK has something called community interest companies, for example, where the directors of the company are not held to simply maximize shareholder value, as company directors are in Canada. They're expected, of course, to produce a financial return so that the company is viable, but they have to also demonstrate that there is a positive social benefit. It could be by hiring people who are hard to employ. It could be working in areas of the country which are particularly disadvantaged. There are ways of measuring what that social benefit is, but the intent is to have a blended return which has both financial and social value created.